And I'm very pleased that I guess I should have deferred on that comment before until the introduction, but I do want to let all of you know that she has only had a few days of preparation time, and that while she is studying for finals and writing papers and trying to finish up her coursework. And so I'm deeply appreciative that Wednesday Jones has appeared at 8 o'clock tonight so that she can present. And then the rest of us, I'm pleased to have the rest of you show up again too, because you're part of our extended family, and I really delight in the conversations that we have week after week. All right, I think I need to share screen. We want slideshow. Start. Hopefully we have Wednesday in front of you.
Looks good.
Wednesday Jones is a regular participant on the forum. So Miss Jones was invited to share a sermon on the Toronto Community of Christ ministry, which reached out to over 80 countries, and this before she was baptized. I think that's rather extraordinary, but it speaks of John Hamer recognizing the genius and articulate ability of this young lady. She was a Reddit contact, and so Bruce Nelson, who's also been on our forum frequently, claims some responsibility for having made initial contact with her for the Community of Christ. And then, of course, she's been on our forum for years. And those contacts apparently have enticed her to join the Community of Christ Fellowship. Her comments on our forum have always enriched our intellect, our long-term goals, and I'm confident she'll be well received tonight as a presenter. Her historical background in Fredrick Madison Smith will provide a comparison with the current changes of stewardship. And so Wednesday, we welcome you and thank you for coming to share with us again. Let me move that.
Thank you. I hope that, sorry, I only had a couple of days, but I hope that I bring something to the table.
Let's pray together and begin with that, and then I'll turn the slides over to you. Steward of our lives, communicating with us through the breath of breeze, magnificence beyond the margins of our perception, through whispered words and illuminating light. We request the presence of your Spirit to mediate, for at times like this, some of us are looking for a fight. We, created in your image as stewards, struggle to raise our competence, to take care of the beautiful earth who has raised us, and now we see growing old, to take care of each other while turning our backs on the hungry children, lonely and cold. We, created in your image, stewards of a bit of time and space, find ourselves at odds, some of us disinclined to address others face to face. To be gracious as you to us, to be patient as you to us, to be able to see beyond our turf as you so generously do for us. And we struggle to retain kindness, to return kindness to those who we perceive as having attempted to take advantage of us. And so this evening, as we meet on Zoom with Sister Jones scheduled to present, we ask your mediation to bless, to round the daggers of our frustration, to open our ears to the sincere stewardships of others that we appreciate instead of resent, that our discussion be amicable, seeking to benefit presenter and participants, that our attitudes adjust to leave us feeling all right, and that we gain sufficient understanding to embrace wisdom, you and each other, to gain insight. In the name of Jesus, the resurrecting Christ. Amen. Wednesday, if I can get the slides to shut down, the floor will be yours. At this stage, I think I need to stop sharing over here. Wednesday?
Give me one moment getting set up. Okay. Sorry, I just realized that some of my text turned gray on accident.
Well, as additional background, let me just provide a little bit of explanation here. I was not aware of this exchange of stewardship until I received a phone call at 1 o'clock on Tuesday, 2 weeks ago, when Loch Mackay called me to let me know that my archaeological project in Nauvoo, Illinois, had concluded. I had not been consulted. I was planning to be there in May. We had the Western Illinois University Field School coming in June and July. Been planning for that, and suddenly all my archaeology at Nauvoo, after 25 summers there, had ended. And I was devastated. Now, I understood, as Locke explained to me, and then I picked up the video Locke left on the church webpage, and that helped. But I cried most of the rest of that day. And the next morning, when I got up and walked around the pond, the sun was rising, and the glassy surface of that mirror reflected the beautiful sunlight to me and reminded me of how important it is to simply stay calm. And so I've been attempting to stay calm. And the effect has been that while people have been approaching me, several people have been approaching me to ask whether or not they should leave the church, I have been able to assure them that I don't believe God's purposes can be defeated, laid aside, and as long as we're working on God's purposes, we're in the right place. And so, just as a preliminary, then let me provide that bit of background. And Wednesday's got her face showing now, so let's turn it back over to her.
Wednesday, are you unmuted?
Okay. Thank you. Is the screen visible and everything?
Yes.
All right. Please bear with me. I am very nervous, but hopefully get this through. So Prophet President Fredrick M. Smith, visionary prophet and authoritarian leader is what I went with titling it. Hopefully I get into a groove soon.
Just to provide one bit of basic background information, Fred M. was one of the three people that went through meticulously to design the 1908 edition of the Book of Mormon for the reorganization, and therefore his Book of Mormon credentials are well established.
All right. So Prophet President Fredrick M. Smith, visionary prophet and authoritarian leader. So just a quick background. I didn't get too deep into this, but Fredrick Madison Smith was one of 9 children of Joseph Smith III and his second wife, Bertha Madison Smith. He was born on January 21st, 1874 at Plano, Illinois, and on August 3rd, 1897, Smith married Ruth Lyman Cobb Smith. I should say, in case anyone's here who is new, Fredrick Madison Smith was the third prophet president of the reorganization. The first being Joseph Smith Jr., the second being, well, not the reorganization, but the first president of the church being Joseph Smith Jr., then Joseph Smith III, and then Fredrick Smith. And that was a picture of him on the side. So some fun things that I got this, oh gosh, okay, cool. So I titled this Prophet, President, PhD, and Psychonaut, which he's not quite prophet yet through some of this, but bear with me. So Fred really believed in human progress and was serious about serious about education. He thought an advanced education is what he needed to prepare for his presiding ministry for the church. For the church. People would criticize him. Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. He thought it was important. So he's one of the first persons to enroll and graduate from Graceland College. He transferred there from Iowa City Academy, the state university, which is now referred to as the State University of Iowa. And he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in spring of 1898. He remained after a year after that at Graceland this next year to teach mathematics. He went to continue on for education, doing something kind of controversial and going outside and further expanding his mind. So he, in 1911, he earns and receives his master's degree from the University of Kansas. And in 1916, Fred M. earned his PhD. He did a lot of study and he studied sociology, but he was informed that to do that, he'd have to study a lot of psychology too. So psychology and sociology, which we'll see how that ties into his theology as we go on in the presentation. So for his PhD study, he researched Native American cultures that used peyote in their worship. Fred M. would become a participant and a proponent of the use of psychedelics in worship. He wrote a dissertation on it, which I thought was interesting. So it focuses on like ecstatic states, which he identifies as inclination ecstasy, which includes sexual love, sacrifice, and religious, aesthetic ecstasy, and that is and intellectual ecstasy. And he believed that these experiences help people to grow, stretch and grow, and that it would lead them often to create beautiful works of art. However, he did offer some warning about alcohol, as that one is the mind-altering substance that people most easily have access to, and he warns that alcohol does the opposite in a lot of cases. So I found that interesting. And I say he was even the peyote plug for some of the church members and friends. So he had to connect with the tribes who were participating in who he would participate in these rituals with, and he would bring some back for, he encouraged members of the church to participate in rituals like these. He was very innovative. Man of God, man of science. So some people there have this separation between religion and science. They think that they have to choose one. That's something I haven't noticed in Community of Christ, that I've been encouraged to accept both. And this is something that I see really exemplified in Prophet President Fredrick Smith. So some church members criticized him for pursuing man's learning when he should have been focused on spiritual learning, in their opinion. And so Fred did take this personally. He believed it was necessary for a person to accomplish all that was possible within their own powers before appealing for divine assistance. He responded to someone who asked him, like, Brother Fred, why don't you pray? And he said, what would you think of a man getting on his knees in prayer and praying for fruit to eat when all around him were numbers of fruit trees loaded with fruit? It was my duty to go the limit of my own powers in order to get what I needed, and failing then and only then would I ask for what I needed. And that gives I guess a little bit about his personality there. He also, like I mentioned, sought out information, not just within the religious community, but outside of it. This was important in his understanding of science and understanding of an aspect of materialism, the material world, was an important stance. Was an important information, important for the church to understand as he moved the church into the future. And you will see something that he's paranoid of is, again, meeting the material needs of people, meeting their spiritual needs, but also meeting their material needs. So there was some skepticism when it came to Fredrick M. Smith in leadership capacities at within the church. So he was called to be an elder at 23 years old, and that was the first priesthood position that he held. He worked for the church and as a historian for a while before this, but his first priesthood calling was to be an elder at 23. And many church leaders were just really skeptical of his leadership capabilities. The older leadership still thought of him as like little Freddie, like this kid. Also when he was called, his call came from his father, who was the president of the church, Joseph Smith III. And a lot of people saw it as, call that must have come out of favoritism rather than based in reflection, spiritual consideration, the experience of the person. This was because he was taken, people took issue with the fact that he immediately went into the Melchizedek priesthood, where they were expected to have experience in the field ministry, which Fred M. did not. They considered, I know that Community of Christ is trying to move away from this now, but they're in the Aaronic priesthood, they considered a lower priesthood. And so they wanted both Fred M. and another young man, Fred B., who was called to be an elder, to go through the same process that, they probably had to go through. And so a missionary coordinator, J.R. Lambert, perceived a spirit of undue haste in the calls for Fred M and Fred B, both young men who are sons of church presidents, directly into the Melchizedek priesthood. He presented his letter to his Decatur district conference meeting, expressing frustration. His letter was accepted into the minutes and was voted down 17-9. So didn't really get off the ground further than that there. And so now I'm going into a bit of his presidency, and something that I've noticed throughout is he is a reformer. So I'm going to go a bit into the structure of the church under Joseph Smith III, so we can get an idea of like how things changed under Fredrick and Smith. So Joseph Smith III came to the presidency in 1860, and when he came to the presidency, more than one leader warned him about not asserting too much control. I think at times, I can only speculate, but I think at times in the early church, there were times where Joseph Smith Jr. exerted a lot of control, and I think some of the saints in the reorganization who I could be wrong about this, but never mind. I just know that now I've lost myself. Some reasons, like what happened at Zion's camp, for example, might be cautious about having that sort of monarchic leadership there. And so the reorganization in its earliest days under Joseph Smith III emphasized common consent in decision making. So how Joseph Smith III had the church organized is he assigned apostles to geographic regions and gave them semi-autonomous authority to run their fields as they saw fit. So it was more like a confederacy of 14 different churches, which each member of the 12 reigned over their own church in this assigned area. The presiding bishopric, through their control of funds, directed their own church, and then the first presidency assumed control over the general. And while this worked while Joseph Smith III was okay with this, and it worked for his personality and leadership style, Fredrick M. Smith, when he was working in his father's presidency, witnessed it and thought it was, he assessed the situation and he thought that the confederated structure had resulted in inconsistent policy between apostles and a strong sense of individualism, and that this led to conflict with the Council of 12 when Fredrick M. Smith assumed the presidency in 1915. Going into some of his previous roles in the church, so Fred M. served in his father's first presidency for 13 years. For 7 of those years, he took on a lot of the responsibilities of the presidency due to his father's old age and declining health. And when he was serving in this regard, he saw a lot of things that disturbed him, and things that required his attention, things that need reforming. His concern focused on many areas, including the proper role of sacraments within the church, supervision of the church finances, the correct position on basic beliefs in the church, and the appropriate role for women, both as leaders and as members. Just a little anecdote that I received in my research for this, that Fred M. planted the seed for women in the priesthood, acknowledging that it was acknowledging that that they would certainly come. And so that was something that was interesting to learn. The main thing that consumed his mental energy at the beginning of his presidency was the proper working relationship among the leadership forums, among the leadership forums. This matter consumed his attention the most because he feared that if he allowed it to continue, the inefficiencies could lead to disorder and the church's demise. In my research of this, the church was falling into a period of stagnancy that I believe Fredrick M. Smith noticed. We'll get into some of the stagnancy with the Council of the 12 as we move forward. So in the General Conference of 1919, there was an interquorum power struggle. And yes, a presidential resignation. So the tipping, this power struggle went on for a while within the context of the leadership without it having come to the general church body. And then, I might have gotten that mixed up. When the first presidency met with the Standing High Council in January before the April 1919 General Conference, they clarified that because the High Council was the court of last appeal, it sat without jurisdiction and rendered decisions impacting the entire church. So the High Council is the ultimate court. And judgment in other courts like elders and bishops court were defined as temporary. These are things that were local and they could be appealed. And because these were things that would have been in the under the control of the 12, many of them saw it as an infringement on their autonomy, which, yeah, that was kind of the thing. And so Fred M. decided to bring the issue to the church body during General Conference in a move to end the tension that he saw as harming the mission of the church. So he did an address to the general body of the church, and his speech focused on the friction between the first presidency and the Council of 12. The friction between the first presidency and the Council of 12, and the his role in trying to smooth over the conflict that was happening. I'm sorry, there's some notes here that I can't see and I've lost my notes again. But that's okay. We'll keep going. He also he presented the issue of the power struggle in a way that aligned the church body with the first presidency, and then isolated the apostles who disagreed with him. And so this was a very calculated move, it seems to be. He also spoke with the church body about revelation that he received and things that he had been made aware of, that they could expand the church and almost colonial expansion, like to expand to different continents and proselytize in wider areas. and the Council of 12 was not necessarily all into that. They were hesitant about it. And so the conference was thrown into chaos when Fred M decides to make a move that is quite a power move. So he tenders his resignation, and the church could, the delegates could vote to accept the reform on the church courts and retain the president, or they could reject the forms and reject the prophet president of the church. So you either keep him and the rules change, or you reject him and see if you can figure out how to to move on without him. So the reforms were accepted, and the 12 was now under, as Fredrick M. Smith wanted, was now fully under the direction of the First Presidency. And there was a quote from the conference. This is how he put it, that he was this is how he put it to the members of the church body. So he reminded the audience about how he had gotten rid of the old mission field designations, and reminded them of the reorganization and authority of the 12. So basically the situation that was happening. But then he admitted that some members had done well with it and had accepted it. There were others who he chastised for their lack of initiative and interfering. And he phrased it as the 12 overreaching and with one example being interfering in the affairs of the local ministers. And so he aligned the First Presidency and the local ministers in the church body, and isolated the 12. And so the vote, it helped the vote go in his favor. Let's see. And he walks out of the room before the vote happens, after he tenders his resignation. This is what he says before he walks out of the room. Unless this solidarity is developed, unless such a charge, unless such large powers in administration are given, and unless our society is bonded by such loyalty, our progress is bound to be slow, and if any is made at all. We have a great plan of social righteousness, but its establishment demands that we have what we have just mentioned. Have we the courage of our convictions? And so he then acquired, he had the power over the 12 that he initially wanted when he observed the problem that he was seeing in Joseph Smith the third's presidency. Something that was really key to Fred M. Smith's presidency and theology, he really revived Joseph Smith Jr.'s Zionic theology, which is for those without context, in this religious context, utopian society, where there's no poor, resources are shared in common, things like that. And so he applied his knowledge of sociology and social welfare to his understanding of Zion. Fred M. was really interested in the social gospel and movement, which applies ethics and problems, including applies Christian ethics to problems, including social justice, healthcare, care for the poor, for the orphans, and for the elderly. He relocated the church headquarters to the consecrated land of Independence, Missouri. And something that he really heavily emphasized was centralization of power. He wanted concentrated power, and he wanted it concentrated in the first presidency and in him, the prophet. So he's linked centralized church governance with Zion. He stated that Zion would be established first by law and order as God set it down, and it must have a strongly centralized and localized powerful government to administer its affairs from the head down. And so that's how he organized Zion. And that is even how he organized the move to Missouri. He had like a industrial committee that was over like getting at the land, buildings, stuff that they would need to move the headquarters, and looking for different business opportunities. So here's a quote from him that is, let us get to, this is what he used to kind of call to action, because not everybody was on board with Fredrick Madison Smith's social gospel view of Zion. This is something that he had to convince slash kind of cajole some people into. And so he says, let's get together and build Zion. Let us begin now. Let us start now. Let us do something that every day will make us feel that we are working towards the establishment of Zion. And then this next one, I had to copy the picture because I couldn't get the quote of it, but my friend Evan Charlie did this, and this is another quote from him that talks about his views on Zion. So from every man according to his capacity and to every man according to his needs, I think has been the accepted as expressing in sloganized form the objective of our social reform based on Christian fraternity. It might be necessary to add that surplus must be placed for the benefit and blessing of the group. From every man according to his capacity and to every man according to his needs, because it is right, because God wills it, because each is his brother's keeper, to the extent of his capacity, and because in a society so organized and functioning, there will be greater happiness, more peace, and class friction will be reduced to a minimum, if not eradicated. And that is the Zionic idea and our goal, onward to Zion. And so that's another piece for him on Zion. And now let's talk about supreme directional control, because between Fredrick Madison Smith and him enacting his vision of Zion is getting the power concentrated into the first presidency. So in April 1924, at a meeting of the Joint Council of it had been reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints then, but the Community of Christ leaders are composed of 12, the members of the First Presidency Council of 12, the presiding bishopric, Fredrick M. Smith presented a document which became known as the Supreme Directional Control Document. 4 apostles and the entire presiding bishopric disputed Fred M's assertions, and they authored a critical letter that they published in the church newspaper, the main one, the Saints Herald. And the leaders asserted that the General Conference was the highest authority of the church, and furthermore insisted that the presiding bishopric, not the first presidency, had full authority over the church and finances between conferences. So this crisis over supreme directional control came to a head during the April 25th April 1925 General Conference. Fredrick Madison Smith's brother, Israel A. Smith, who would become the fourth president of the church, warned Fred not to force a vote on supreme directional control, and that he would be accountable for those who fell away from faith. But Fredrick Madison Smith decided to force the vote on supreme directional control, and it passed 915 to 405. So this victory for Fredrick had positive and negative consequences. So something that happened was the presiding bishopric resigned, along with Apostle John Rushton. The conference also failed to sustain a second opposition apostle, Thomas W. Williams, ending his ministry in that office. And there was a schism in membership. A lot of members went to the Temple Lot Church or the Hendrickites. And then on April 18th, Fred M. Issued the revelation that became Doctrine and Covenants 1, that became 135. Oops. Sorry. My slides are slightly out of order.
If I may, Wednesday, let me insert that in section 135, Fred M. said on paragraph 3, the promise has been given that no power shall stay the hand of God in the accomplishment of his purposes among his people.
Yes, I had my slide mixed up, so I wasn't able to pull it up, but yes.
You got it on this page.
Huh?
Now you have it midway down this page.
Yeah. So a lot of this kind of stuck out to me. So yeah, it is wisdom that the brethren of the presiding bishopric be released from further responsibility in that office, and that Albert Carmichael shall be ordained and act to the office of presiding bishop for a time. He choose from among the bishops to act as two counselors. So he had to acknowledge the way that he had so many people exit. Yeah, so he makes this very strong statement. The hastening time is here, and greater unity than ever before is necessary if the forces of opposition are to be met. And such unity will prevail if those holding the priesthood will remember their commission to preach the gospel, and each officer will strive to discharge his own duty and magnify his calling. The promise has been given that no power shall stay the hand of God in the accomplishment of his purposes among his people. And the church shall move forward in its great work. The fulfillment of the prophecy may cause saints to tremble at the exhibition of divine power, yet they shall rejoice in the protection of his grace. That kind of clarifies his reasoning for doing what he did, and says that God wills it. So to fulfill his vision of Zion, he initiated a lot of ambitious programs. So the construction of the auditorium in Independence, the expansion of the Independent Sanitarium, which was later known as the Independence Regional Hospital, construction of an old age home in Independence, originally known as Rest Haven, now the Groves, and a planned agricultural cooperative. An agricultural co-op in Atherton, Missouri. He also was focused on modernizing the church, bringing the church to the current times and towards the future. And so as a part of his modernization program, Smith was an early adopter of radio. In 1924, the RLDS Church's first radio station, known as K-Fix, which is now later KLDS, became the first church-owned radio station in the United States to be licensed.
If I may, Wednesday, let me add that at the Joseph Smith III home, we also see his interest in technology, because in the 1880s, he got a Kodak camera and transformed one of the closets into a dark room.
Oh, that's fascinating. Like for photography?
Yes. And so we have just put up a camera in the hallway to let people know that the Fredrick's ghost is still filming people there, and they should not be picking up artifacts and carrying them out.
Got you. All right. Fred M. I'm gonna have to refresh again. I apologize. Fred M. Wrote hymns and poetry. So "Onward to Zion" is a famous hymn that he wrote. And he, when people were talking, there was a lot going on over Supreme Directional Control, because it was obviously very controversial. That I went over the conference briefly, but like Fred M. was up there accusing people of treason. It was a lot. He wrote this: "There was once a preacher erratic who had some queer things in his attic. So he said, I sure see in this mute SBC a gesture of rule autocratic." So he knew exactly what his leadership style was in this case. Now, for an area where he was not at the forefront, who did the prophet leave behind? So he made few comments on the topic of racial segregation. He was for the establishment of Zion. He thought it was more important to put social stability first, and therefore avoided want to say correct, but any polarizing ideas at the time on the practice of segregation. He prioritized order and meeting material social needs and reducing class conflict as the priority. This, of course, penalized members who were unlike him and had no effect on members who were more like him. This was the attitude of much of the church during this era. So the Black saints in the church at this time were facing trials and facing racism and discrimination, and even in someone who did pull the church forward, we find this. And there was a story I wanted to share from an African-American church member named Amy Burke Robbins. She lived in Battle Creek, Michigan, and they were attending their first church reunion, and Fredrick M. Smith was the guest minister. And if I'm not mistaken, this would have been like a congregation that had a good bit of Black people. In her memoirs, Robbins wrote with excitement of anticipation of actually seeing the prophet in person. She considered him a little lower than an angel, a chosen representative of Christ, a man of God who was to lead us and the people of God to Zion. However, Fredrick M. Smith would cause her some disillusionment. And there was apparently an African-American man chauffeured Smith to the camp, and it caused unease. And then questions asking, people at the camp started asking questions about this throughout the reunion. And from the pulpit, Smith assured the congregation that, he assured the congregation that the man was his chauffeur, but used blatantly racist language in his explanation. And then Amy Robbins reported, "I did not remember anything more than that what was said in that talk. I don't think in all my life I ever had such a hurt, such a bitter disappointment. My angel or saint or prophet had fallen from the pedestal on which I had placed him." She continued, "My eyes were filled with tears and my face burned with shame and humiliation." She did remain an active member of her congregation, as not those in her association, many of those in her association, she felt some people in her association did not hold the same views that Fredrick M. did. Elsewhere in her account, she writes of the love and appreciation that she received at the Battle Creek congregation. And I have a little bit on peace and violence. I didn't get to go into this one too deeply, but both Joseph Smith III and Fred M. were faced with wars during their presidency. Joseph Smith III during the Civil War, Fredrick M. during Wars I and II. And despite its aims at being a peace church, the church was still defining what that meant. Both prophet presidents encouraged members to serve if they were drafted. The reasoning for this was, Joseph Smith III's reasoning was that the sins of taking lives would fall at the feet of the nation and not the individual soldiers. And then Fredrick M. Smith was more of a nationalist. He was supported conscientious, but both supported conscientious objection of priesthood members to an extent. like at one point, Fredrick M. Smith went down to DC to have a conversation with like someone from the presidential administration who did not give him an audience to understand exactly the limitations and how conscientious objection would work. And there was debate over what was the right thing to do. So we had there were pacifists who were apostles who disagreed, and you know, but I will need to go more into that because but there's complicated feelings around complicated ideas around peace and violence, and I wouldn't call either approach pacifist. And Fred M. was definitely very political, and while I understand why being committed to like, yeah, the Third Reich is pretty evil, but he was on like record like praising Woodrow Wilson in the first and during the First World War, and he does get criticized from church members about that. Yeah, and it kind of goes along with his idea of strong centralization, because he did think that the United States government was one of the United States government was important for progress, like the United States was making, like the United States was like leading progress, and he thought that so he wanted to he was a nationalist. However, they did contend with peace. So when he got drafted, he chose to serve in a way that was behind the line. So, you know, stretcher bearing nursing, caring for the wounded, maintaining the base hospitals, running the supply trains, that sort of thing. So complicated ideas about peace and violence. And then the next thing I wanted to pose was just kind of like his legacy. So I see a lot of the fruits of his reform in Community of Christ. The social gospel has remained at the forefront. The being open to new truths, which was revitalized, and in this way, an opening of accepting modern science and a force in bringing a force in helping to create this vision of Zion that Community of Christ purports today. He also pulled the church out of a pretty stagnant spot. However, the way he did it, which might have been the way to do it, was authoritarian. And even if that was the way to do it, then it does set a precedent for each presidency to follow. Even though some of the research says that you know, that supreme directional control is no longer advanced, I do think that we still have some remnants of it in the church today. That's all I have for you.
All right. Thank you, Wednesday, for a remarkably thorough treatment. I think that we were asking for 10 or 15 minutes of introduction here, and you have covered it so much more thoroughly than what I anticipated. Because
I'm sorry.
you only had 2 weeks. And so we didn't expect you to fill the whole hour, and here you've done that with a wealth of information. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. I do want to add 2 comments. In his library in the Joseph III home, we find Origin of the Species by Darwin, of course Karl Marx as well, and you've already given us the close parallel between Karl Marx and what Fred M had to say about the taking from people according to their abilities and giving them back according to their needs. So again, the very profound effect of his sociological background and the impact that those 2 gentlemen had upon the science of that age. But it's just a very interesting combination that he put together. Particularly, I found it interesting though to see that he didn't seem to have any conflict between his scientific thinking, and his religious thinking. So that struck me as being very curious. There is one key theme in there relative to the actions of the church the churches 2 weeks ago, and that is that question of whether the conference remains the final deciding body, or if that should be the bishops. And that's one of the areas of tension that remains today, because the bishops made the decision, and many of the people feel like their democratic prerogatives have been abridged.
Yes.
Let's open the floor, and then we have hands, and so let's open the floor and give people a chance to raise questions and comments. And please, Wednesday has spoken quite authoritatively here, but we did intend to make this discussion a more open one, so people could share their feelings, their understandings relative to the transition of stewardship. And yet the background that Wednesday has provided shows that the transition of stewardship through the church history is an ongoing process.
Okay,
Stand up.
Ron Smith has his hand up. Go ahead, please, Ron.
Yeah, you mentioned Fred M's fascination with the peyote religion and his experimentation with peyote and stuff. But I just learned something fairly recently, just this last week, in fact, that he sent, Fred M sent Hubert Case to Oklahoma to the his appointment was to the Indians there, and Fred M had Hubert report directly to him and not to the apostles, because of the apparently because of the prejudice that was within some of the apostles, and whether or not they should be going to the Indians and trying to bring the gospel there. And I thought that was just an interesting piece of the whole puzzle, and so I thought I'd bring it up.
Thank you.
Thanks you. Yes.
That's in the Red Man's Hope is the
Okay, I
source.
haven't read that one.
Okay, David DeBarth, go ahead, please. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. I clicked it, but I didn't get it. Didn't get it changed. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Comment that I see an interesting modification in the church between Fred M. Smith's authoritarian rule and the apostles' desire to have the conference be the ultimate deciding body. in my experience today, the conference still is the deciding body. The conference could vote to remove the prophet or to remove the bishopric. The conference still has that authority, but most of the decisions, because of time and other kind of things, are made by the leadership council, the leadership team. Paul said the bishopric made the decision, and that's a question. Well, the bishopric didn't make the decision. The leadership council made the decision, and I can't tell you who all's in that council. I hope maybe somebody can, but I know the first presidency, the bishopric, the quorum of 12, the presiding evangelist, and there are some others, I think. The presidents of 70, perhaps. It's a fairly large group that made the decision to move the resources from being property resources to fund resources, putting those in endowments so that we could have the funds to work with. There's been a push for a number of years for the church to realize that money we spend in properties does not get spent for people. And so that emphasis is something I see continuing on. If we have the money that we can spend to send people to foreign countries to spread the gospel, that's better than having that money in properties. The money is still there. The funds are, the total equity is still there. It's just in an endowment now instead of in properties. But I did want to point out that I disagree with my brother that the bishopric made that decision.
I'm willing to stand corrected. I do agree that it was the overall. However, when we look at the pattern that the presentation has been given to the world, you'll see it's two lines, one income and one expense. And I don't see any other lines there that detail with the spiritual well-being of the church. I don't see that that the other factors that I felt could have been considered were, and so therefore, I think the bishopric was dominant in that decision as portrayed by those two lines of action.
I would agree that the two lines are there. I would say that finances made a decision, not the bishopric. But that's we can discuss that tomorrow night.
Okay. Forum is open for your discussion, and we do want to respect the various vantage points because we're really talking here about stewardship of the restoration movement.
David, go ahead.
I wanted to comment on Fred M. Smith's Zionic processing. My mother grew up in Independence, born in 1912. So she was a child through, what would we say, Fred M. was in 1919. He became the president. So she lived there in Independence during a major part of his tenure. And she was really caught up with that Zionic principle kind of thing. But she talked a lot, or not talked a lot, she taught us about the gathering process. She was really concerned that people weren't following Fred M's example or Fred M's teaching about the gathering process. She said people would just pack up and gather to Independence and said, here they are, now what are you going to do with them? Where Fred M was saying, if you want to gather to Zion to help us build up this community, you need to meet with the bishopric, make this, decide how you will fit in and what you will contribute and where you will best contribute, and use that actual process for a gathering rather than just showing up. And the church members, like we so often do, kind of tended to ignore that. The gathering continued on in independence of the RLDS group just by people deciding they wanted to show up and then had to figure out what are we going to do with them now they're here. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Well, I would also add that the note that you made about the support of the war effort and the people who opposed that. The fact that F. Henry Edwards was his counselor, and F. Henry Edwards had refused to go fight for the British and came within hours of being executed, and so came to America as a pacifist and a dear friend and counselor with Fred M. And to appreciate that, yes, he was a nationalist, and yet here one of his closest counselor and advisor was a pacifist, speaks of that tug and pull in the church. And we still have some of that. The 19th century Easter program at the Joseph III House on March 30 will involve some of that discussion.
Yeah, and he listened to him, which is something that is interesting. He definitely considered his opinion. At least if I'm recalling correctly. I did a lot of reading in a short period of time.
Mhm. Okay, Val, go ahead, please.
Paul, I know you have kind of a personal stake in the change of ownership because it immediately cut into your archaeological work. But can you articulate what you see as the losses to the community of Christ from losing that property? Like what won't you be able to do, or what will be the problems that arise for the community of Christ because of the change of ownership?
I participate with the Wednesday night gathering of followers of the way, which is centered around Nauvoo, and to hear their concerns after that decision. For these are people who have lived, who moved to the Nauvoo area or have lived in the Nauvoo area for many years, who have invested their lives in telling the story of the church as they have understood it. And their clear regret is that their story no longer has a base from which to be told. One of the specifics, Val, that we lose here, the summer kitchen by the homestead has for 50 years been manned by Lois and Linda, twin ladies who have invested their lives in learning the crafts and skills of the 19th century. They have a beautiful collection of cast iron, but they have been there teaching people how to spin, teaching. Well, they made gooseberry pie for me. They made biscuits and all kinds of things, and just the simple fact that those skills are now being retired. Yes, there may be somebody else that can pick that up, but that building, that site has been for the last 50 years the best representation of 19th century of 1839 Nauvoo that we've had. And in the meantime, the LDS have built a vast number of the brick buildings of the church leaders, but largely have ignored the poor. And I anticipate that is one of the losses that we'll continue to see, because rich people have a tendency to be able to support and afford their reconstructions, whereas poor people don't have that prerogative.
So it's so the Nauvoo area has been kind of the tourists coming through and people coming back to revisit church history. You feel like, and was that something that a lot of Community of Christ people did, and that's where the loss is?
Yes, that is a significant part of the loss. I certainly would be happy to yield to other people on that point, but you asked me explicitly that there's my rather deeply grounded feeling.
David, go ahead.
Robert would be a one that should answer there, I think, because
Oh,
he's one that lives in Macomb and lived in Nauvoo many years.
My response to Val's question, I think it's an excellent question. I think there's some left over from the conflict between Emma and Brigham. And they have very different views of a lot of different things. And the RLDS Community of Christ naturally is following Emma's, and the Utah Church is following Brigham. And so that the story from Emma's viewpoint may get lost. Now, is that important is a different question. How I think this forum has pretty well proved that some of those differences are far less important than they used to be. So for me, yes, that is a loss, but is that loss really that significant, or can we continue the kind of things we're doing here between all of our restoration branches and continue to tell the story of history in a rather understanding and combined approach?
Okay, Robert, go ahead.
I can probably best answer the question about what it means just from my own personal point of view. I live in the Nauvoo area because of the history of the church. And I fell in love with Nauvoo and with the story that I was reading about the people of that era very early on. I've listened very carefully to the things that have been said by our church leaders. I find it particularly curious that they talk about the fact that these things are just physical things, and that we can still tell the history of the church effectively without them, or without owning them might be a little more accurate. The problem is that even in the church online sessions talking about this, that many of the church leaders, not just one, but many of them who were involved in the decision, talk with great passion about the spiritual experiences they had, particularly in the Kirtland Temple. And for me, that's the biggest issue. Even though I live in Nauvoo, my own family history is deeply involved with the Kirtland Temple, and that's always been important to me. And I've had my own spiritual experiences there. But the problem is, well, there are a couple of problems. One is that conflict between talking about the experiences they had and then effectively removing that opportunity for those who follow now. Now, you can say that we could go and view the Kirtland Temple, and it isn't so much the doctrine as it is, there is something about knowing that it's part of your movement that is effective, and it also is part of knowing that part of being a part of your own faith group that goes there in a group. And that's where I've had the experiences I've had, was in a priesthood retreat when I was living in the Chicago area, and went there, and some very amazing things happened. I see a pattern in the church of diminishing the history. I tried to listen carefully to leaders who have said that they're not doing that, but I see a pattern that the church is trying to. I think the best description of this that I've read was by one of the Methodist professors of the early leaders who were in the seminary in Kansas City, and I think he called it, can I say this, demythologicizing. I don't know how to pronounce that, but basically trying to get rid of the myths in the church. Trouble is, most of those myths are spiritual experiences that are difficult for people who are using their own minds to try and construct their theology, difficult for those people to deal with. I'm concerned about all this, and at the moment I feel a bit like a ship that's lost its tie to the dock and its anchor and its sail, and I'm just drifting around. I don't know where I end up, but I do know that the church, as I learned about it in my early years, going back to the 50s, remains important to me. I don't know if I'm making any sense or not, but I do think that when we can no longer feel like it's something that's ours, that it does make a difference.
Thanks, Robert. We got lots of